Alright, we've got a model over here, and now this thing is going to need to be UV unwrapped. So if we go into the UV editing space, and I set UV sync selection to on, you can see that the UVs are a goddamn mess. We could just select all and smart UV project, which would do a decent job of splitting everything apart, but as you can see, it's also making all these islands a total utter mess. And when we break this down into a texture, that means that we're going to have not a lot of resolution to be working with. So let's show that to you. We'll make a new material real quick. And over here in the shading tab, we'll then make an image texture, a new one, and we'll make a UV grid. The resolution really doesn't matter all that much, but since the eventual resolution is going to be 2048 by 2048, might as well do that. And if we connect that up into our base color, you can see what the UVs look like. And it's not too bad, but especially here on the face, things are a fucking mess. So back here in the UV editing space, we're gonna come up here to our options, turn on live unwrap. And then what we'll do is we'll just start selecting edges. So I'll say this edge over here, hold on control, clicking this, it'll take the shortest part there. And then the edge tag mode, I'm gonna set to tag seam. This way, every single time I click on something, it's going to tag it as a seam. And because we've got live unwrapping turned on, it'll automatically make a new unwrap. This way we can easily, very quickly create our manual UV unwrap, which in this case is probably not going to be that much better than the auto projecting. But part of this whole series is showing you my workflow and especially showing you when I run into issues and what those issues actually are. Holding Alt, we can select this entire loop and we can just mark that as a seam. And we'll do that for all of these loops actually. It's quite a lot of geometry detail onto this object, so the unwrapping process is actually going to take a little longer than any of my other enemies that I've made so far. And now that we've done a little bit of unwrapping, we can go back to showing the material here, and we can see the actual UVs and how things are scaled and all that kind of stuff, which is useful information. We can also see that all this black stuff doesn't have UVs yet, and as such, doesn't show the actual texture. But using this, we can also look around and see what parts might be stretched out a little too much and what parts might need a little bit more work on it. Now, every time we put down a new seam, you can see the actual textures update because they now have new UV coordinates. So I don't necessarily think that we actually need to put seams on these top edges because as you can see, this doesn't look very stretched. We can probably get away with that without too much trouble. And if you want to make sure that that is the case, we can come up here and enable display stretch. And this will display the amount of stretch that your UV islands have. So you want this to be as blue as possible. The kind of green stuff, that's alright to have. Not too much of it preferably, but it's alright. As soon as it starts going into the oranges, yellows and reds, that's where you have to really start putting down some more stuff. So you can see that there's a bit of stretching going on here because there's no seams. These squares are a lot smaller than these squares and there's no cutting going on there. So the way we fix that is probably by edge selecting all of these islands in between. And I knew I was going to make things a little more difficult for myself when I made all of this extra detail with geometry rather than just doing it through a texture. But this does end up probably looking a lot better when we're finished with this. So I don't regret it. And it hopefully makes for interesting content as well, and if it doesn't, that's, well, that's a bit of a pain for me, isn't it? Because then I'm doing this for nothing. If I wasn't live commentating, I'd be listening to a podcast right now, which would make this entire process a lot easier to deal with. So we can actually see there is a decent bit of stretching going on here after all, so maybe we'll need to put some seams along the top edges as well. I'm really hoping we don't need to, but in the end, we might not have much of a choice. Luckily, these two parts of the body, with all these little channels in it, is definitely going to be the most painful part to do. So the moment we finish this, everything else should kind of fall into place, is at least my hope. And if things get much too confusing, what you can always do is just select an object and hide it. Another thing to keep in mind while you're unwrapping is that you probably should have a decent idea as to how you're going to texture this thing. And I know that that's probably going to be the next video, but I'll give you a little bit of a insight into my process there as well. And that is that these little channels that are inset, that are extruded inwards, are going to have a separate material. In the very end product, that's probably all going to get baked down into one single texture and then into a single material again. But for the process of making those textures, this entire channel is probably going to have a separate material from these, for lack of a better term, islands, right? So having the seams being on the bottom here rather than on the top, I'm probably going to get rid of the seams on the top here, makes a lot of sense, because this over here, this face, is going to have to be the same material and a somewhat connecting texture to what's up here, while this channel down here is going to have a separate material on it anyway. So having the seam between those two faces makes the most sense. Of course, if I had thought about that a little earlier, I would have done this entire seam first, rather than having to do it now and then having to clear away the seam that I placed before. But as I said before, the entire point of this series is showing you my work process, and that also includes making dumb mistakes and fixing those mistakes. Luckily, if you use this method and you go over something that's already a seam, it'll actually just clear it from being a seam altogether. So this is a very easy way to fix mistakes like that. Sometimes it's a little iffy on not wanting to work though, so it's not great. And I'm missing some seams here, and that's why everything is being all stretchy and weird. So we go back to placing some more seams until everything is all seamed up. And remember, this is only one of the 2 body segments that I need to do. I've been at this for 20 minutes. Complaining about tedious work is also part of my work process. It doesn't serve any productive functionality other than keeping me from going actually insane. And this is why smart UV projecting, even though it's not entirely perfect, sometimes preferable. So if you want to check whether or not something is entirely isolated and not connected to any other islands anymore, these are the UV islands, you can just hover over it in face select mode and press L, and it will select all of the linked islands over in this side over here. And then you can see, okay, so I've missed this island over here. Going back into edge select mode will then allow me to quickly unwrap around this island. Then pressing 3 to go back in face select mode, selecting all of the connected things for the channel down below. And this seems to be, we've got another one over here. And now when we look around, there's nothing else linked to this. So we can take a look over at this side and see if that's all pretty blue. There's a little bit of stretchiness going on here. So we can select these faces, just like a handful of them, and see which ones those are. I'm assuming they are these ones. Alright, so the best way to do this, it's this outer ring over here. So if we edge select, we can see it's not this one. This one seems more or less fine too. The edge flow is a little fucked up here, that's a problem. Oh, and as we can see, the reason that this is all stretched over here is because I didn't actually close this loop with seams. So now that I've done that, we can see the stretchiness problem is all gone, and this now kind of looks like the labyrinth of paths that we've made over here without too much stretching. Now we can see that all these separate things over here are the islands that we've made, and they are all a little bit stretched. So instead of making an entire go around making the top rows here all seams, which is not going to do too much in reality, what we can do is we can just pick the point where there is the most stretchiness over here. Then with the period key on the numpad, we can orbit around specifically those vertices, or edges in this case, and just mark that specific edge as a seam. And as you can see, that immediately solves a lot of the stretchiness problem. So we select this one as well, go back to our active window here and mark seam. You don't even need to see it. All you need to know is that there's stretchiness going on here, right? So as long as you have a reasonable idea as to what the vertices you're selecting are, you don't need to know exactly what you're working with. So let's just select all of these edges and mark them all as a seam. There's a couple more that we need to mark as seams. We can do this one as well, that's okay. And they don't need to be all just perfectly blue, right? As long as they are not too green, then that's fine. Like, there's a little bit of turquoise going on here for sure. I don't really mind that too much, so we can just leave those alone. Alright, that's the main body UV unwrapped. Now the legs. Let's hide the main body here, the head, so that we can easily get into the legs. And this actually isn't going to be as difficult as you might think, because we can just edge select this and then select a ring around here. And just that will be enough to unwrap this in theory. For some reason, these aren't connected to each other, which is not great to begin with, but we'll just ignore that for now. And as you can see, that is a properly unwrapped little joint thing point. And now we need to do that for all of these other ones as well. Isn't that great? So realistically, what we should do here is we should have unwrapped this before applying the mirror modifier, because then I would have known the seams for all of these legs are gonna be in the same place. We didn't do that, so now we have to manually do all of them. Luckily, it's not really that difficult, because we can literally just like click, 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 3 clicks on every single one of these legs, and that's all it takes. The legs themselves gonna be a bit more of a pain to deal with though, but in the end, those are more or less just cylinders as well, so they're gonna be easy to unwrap. Those very basic primitive shapes, you can get away with being a little sloppy with them, because they're quick to unwrap. Same with the fangs here, we'll do them in a moment. We'll mark seam for all those at the same time, and there you go. All those chain links now unwrapped. And in a pretty undistorted way as well. I mean, there's a little bit of distortion there, but that's going to be very small details, so it doesn't really matter. I'll do the eyes as well now. Unwrapping a sphere is just a matter of cutting it in half. That's good enough. Especially since these eyes, if they're a little bit distorted, that's not going to be too big a deal, because they're going to be a single color that's just going to be emissive. So there's not going to be too much like tiling issues or unwrapping issues going on here at all. So I'm being a little bit fast and loose with where I actually put all of these seams for the eyes, because it literally doesn't matter. And we can unwrap those as well. Now for something like this, which is closer to a normal cylinder, we select the bottom face and the top face, and then just one line connecting the two of them. And we unwrap that, and the fangs also unwrapped. And for these little buggers over here, that's going to be a little bit more interesting, because we need to select this edge over here, as well as this edge. You can select an entire edge loop by holding Alt down, if I hadn't said that already, by the way. Only if your topology actually flows well though, which in my case is about half of the time. Then we also need to select these rings on the inside. And then we simply just select a ring going in this direction. Preferably one that's going to be more or less obscured by the body itself. So on the inside here. And we'll just do that with every single one of these. And just like that, we've done one side over here. And now we just need to do the exact same thing over here on the other side. I try to be somewhat consistent in where I put the seams between the different legs. Sometimes, especially with like these horizontal seams, they're not in the exact same position. In the end, that doesn't matter too much, so don't beat yourself up with that kind of detail. As long as it's in a functional place where it works, that's all that matters. Your eventual player or viewer or whatever you're making this for isn't going to know that. Now, the entire process for doing these two shapes, we're going to do again for every leg, for this one, and this one, and that one, and that one. So I'm not going to go over all that because that's just repetitive and boring. But I want to show you that, in fact, if we hide everything here real quick, these legs are really still just cylinders. So what we can do is we can go into face select, select this face, Going back into edge select, just select a random line between the two and unwrap those as well. And now we've done that as well. So if we now unwrap this entire thing with everything being selected, because everything that you've got hidden is not used in the unwrap. So we've hidden a few things, now we've unhidden them, and you can see everything is a mess. That's not a big deal. We can just press the unwrap button, it'll unwrap everything again. And you can see that pretty much everything about this at this point is the same process we've done, just these joints will have to do like another 8 of them, and then the legs themselves we have to do another like 15 of them. And we have to do the same process here with the back part of the body as well. I think the only really interesting bits we've got left here would be these two like tower generator things. So let's do those first, and then we'll just skip to the final results after that. So realistically, this isn't going to be too different from a cylinder, because we just select the edges around the bottom and then the edges around the top. But the same thing I said before about the little channels over here, which are going to be a separate material, at least for the texturing process, also holds true for the tops of these things. Because these faces, that being all of these faces together, you get the point, are going to be a emissive color. So I could, if I wanted to, put the seams up here at the very top edge. But instead I'm going to put the seam over on this edge instead, because this is going to be a edge between materials anyway. And I don't really have to worry too much about these faces being slightly stretched, because in the end that's going to be one solid emissive color. So there's no texture there to get stretched. So then I just take a line from the top to the bottom of this tower, and you can suddenly say it's beautifully unwrapped. We just do the same thing on the other tower as well, and then there's just a lot of repeat actions for the rest of this unwrapping, which I'm not going to bother you with, because you've seen my process now, and from here it's just tedium. And as I've said before, I like to listen to a podcast or something like that while I do things like this, and I would very much like for the remaining like hour and a half of this process to be able to do that. One last thing though is I'm going to make this symmetrical so that these seams, if there's any texture seams at all, I'm going to try to prevent there to be any texture seams that are too obvious. But if there's any seams at all, at least they're symmetrical and they're visually somewhat pleasing. And after a long little while here, we've got everything unwrapped, and you can see the UV maps here over on the left hand side, where you will be able to see that there is a fair few things that are very small in scale. Things like the eyes and the links between the leg portions. Those aren't going to require too much detail anyway. The automatic packing process is pretty good at looking at the difference in scale on the model and maintaining that in the actual UV maps. That being said, sometimes there is an argument to be made for cutting things up a little bit more, just so that they can be packed a little more tightly. There's a lot of wasted space around here and around here. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to select a couple of edges here. This material is going to be a solid color or close to a solid color anyway. So it doesn't matter if I cut out a couple of things here, or cut loose a couple of things rather. And especially for parts like these ones, where we are clearly like going around one of these energy towers, we probably want to disconnect those anyway. There's no real good reason to keep those connected, and it only takes up empty space. As well as helping, in theory, making things that are stretched a little bit, like this light blue over here, stretch a little less. Not significantly so, but technically speaking. That's pretty good. So over in the viewport being selected here, I can then mark those all as a seam, and it will automatically unwrap everything again. And from here, it's a little bit of a puzzle, right? So what we can do is we can go into face select mode and select the big space wasting islands, such as these over here. And assuming we have individual origins as our selection mode, we can just scale those down. These are going to be solid colors anyway, so it doesn't matter too much if they're scaled down because they don't need to have a lot of detail in them. All they require is a somewhat decent amount of room to have a color applied to them. And then I see we also have this one over here. Where did that actually end up in this UV mess? We have that one, and then probably also this one is a good one. Probably scale down, and then I think these two, they can all be scaled down significantly. And now we'll look over the model. Is there anywhere on this body that's scaled significantly differently? One thing to keep in mind is that when you scale the UVs down, the texture scales up. So let's scale this back to what it was before. And while I scale, look at the texture over here, right? So now I'm scaling this up. That makes the texture smaller. And if I scale it down, that makes the texture bigger. Anyway, so now we've cleared up quite a bit of room. So we can select all, press F3, and type in pack islands. That then intelligently packs all the islands at their current size. And this way we can take a look around. The eyes don't need a particularly large amount of detail either, so we can select all of those as well. Because again, these are going to just be a solid emissive red color. And we can scale all of those down. They need to be big enough to actually like register a couple of pixels of a emissive map, but nothing beyond that. And this is not UV unwrapping related, but I realized a moment ago that there's actually a face on the inside of this model. So if I go into a solid view here, you can see this is a face, which it shouldn't, but it does have a face. So let's remove that face because it is taking up UV space and we don't want that. What we can also do is go select by interior faces, and that will now select all of the interior faces in the entire model. And we can just delete all of those faces, and there we go. That helps quite a lot. It's a lot faster than doing manually. And also helps if there's any inside faces that you might not be aware of. So this entire part of the body is one island. And that seems a little much to me. So we're actually going to cut this up into a number of different smaller islands. And the best way I can think of doing that is putting seams on all of these lines. Either that or a other potential option would be putting seams along the tops here. That would probably be less obvious actually. Let's do that instead. You'll note that I accidentally used the live unwrap, and now the channels over here, which I scaled down before, and likely the eyes as well, are back to being big, which is annoying as hell. So sometimes you might have to go through these kind of things a number of different times, which is just kind of the way the world works. I just really wish that when it unwrapped the thing, it would remind itself as to the sizes of the islands, because I needed to make a little adjustment and now I have to redo all that again. But you get the point. Next time we're going to get into texturing this thing and the way that my process for that works without being able to draw or paint to save my life. Still being able to make nice looking textures for your models. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page.